I'd like to welcome everyone today to the DairyXnet webinar on discovering hidden feed costs for the milking herd. I'd like to first introduce myself. I'm Donna Amaral Phillips. I will be the moderator for today's session. I'm an Extension Dairy Specialist at the University of Kentucky and the project leader for DairyXnet. So with that, I'd like to go ahead and introduce our speaker for today, Dr. Mike Brock. He received both his BS and MS degrees from the University of Missouri at Columbia and his PhD from South Dakota State. Following completion of his PhD in animal sciences, he was on the faculty at South Dakota State and then at the University of Missouri Columbia with the Commercial Agriculture Program. In December of 1998, he joined the faculty of Kansas State University as a state dairy extension specialist. His current responsibilities include the development of programs in dairy cattle nutrition, management, cow comfort, replacement heifer development, dairy expansion, and heat stress abatement. He also continues to be active in dairy cattle nutrition, focusing on nutrient management, byproducts, and pre- and post-calving feeding and management. In addition to his extension and research responsibilities, Mike teaches several undergraduate and graduate courses and advises both undergraduate and graduate students. He has served as the faculty coordinator of the KSU Dairy Teaching and Research Unit. The 250 Holstein herd currently has a rolling herd average of over 30,000 pounds of milk and also includes over 300 replacement heifers. For the past 6 years, he has coached the KSU Dairy Challenge team and previously served as an advisor to the Dairy Club there and also as an advisor to the Midwest ADSA Student Affiliate Division. He currently serves as co-chairperson of the Western Dairy Management Conference and is president of the Midwest section of Animal Science. So with that, Mike, we welcome you today to talk about the discovering hidden feed costs for the milking herd.
Thank you, Donna, and thanks for everyone that's joining us today and those that will join us later via the recording. So I want to get right into our discussion today as we look at some hidden feed costs and some things that we can do to help producers be more profitable in this time of financial stress. And most of you are well aware of the issues that we've had with feed costs in the last 12 to 18 months, and even though we've seen some moderation in that, I think we probably still have some issues that we can address. And first one we'll spend some time talking about is just shrink or physical loss of feed on the farm. Spend a little time talking about some of the variation that we see in feedstuffs as well as in the mixing, primarily today looking at the variation we see in mixing, and then what are we doing with refusals, and then how does inventory that we maintain on some of these byproducts, how does that figure into cost, and are we actually calculating the interest in that calculation when we look at our rations. So just real quick, just to kind of maybe give folks an update. I don't know, some folks watch this milk to feed price ratio. And for those of you that do, I think that's great. For those of you maybe haven't been doing that, I think maybe you something you might want to consider. It does, point out some interesting things to us. The red bars are 2001, the dark blue bars are 2012, and then the green bars are where we're at currently here in 2013. So you can see things really have actually been improving here in 2013 as far as this ratio, and a lot of that's just associated with some of the moderation that we've seen in feed prices, and also the increase in the price of milk on the farm. So I do want to remind everybody that you have to go up to the top of that screen to 3 basically on that chart to find where, we used to consider that, anything above that level to be a good place for the dairy farmers. It's been a long time since we've been there. So we are operating on some very, very narrow margins when it comes to feed cost. Even though things have improved, we still have some issues out there that are really making it a challenge for many of our producers. So before I get into some of the other things, there's a couple things I guess I wanted to point out. And our ag economists here at K-State spent some time looking at dairy farms around the state and looking at profitability. And in this chart that you see on the screen, we've got these farms divided into three different groups. So the first column there would be the average of all farms in terms of cost per hundredweight of milk produced. Then we've got the high 1/3 of the profit, the medium 1/3 based on profit, and then the low 1/3 of the group based on profit. And then the final column there on the right would be just the difference between the high and the low group. So as we look at profitability, what's important on the dairy farm? And you can see as you look at that column on the right, those farms that fall into the high profitability group in this data, they have some advantages in certain areas, okay? Things like machinery, things like interest at least on a per hundredweight basis. And in case you're wondering, this information was collected over 10 years, and it involves about 43 farms. So we got quite a few observations in this. They vary in size, anywhere from about 40 cows upwards to about 700 cows. So pretty good range of farms in this data. So one of the things that they did in this study, if you're kind of wondering what the profitability actually was, so all farms during that 10-year period, their net return per hundredweight was $2.13, but you can see that high profitability group, their average was 71 cents. So they did substantially better than the low 1/3 profitability group. So they're, and I think that we do have farms out there that even in challenging times can show a profit. And one of the things I think you want to really look at is the first line in that column, the high 1/3 profitability group. They were averaging just a little under 23,000 pounds of milk per year. The low profitability group, only not even quite 18,000 pounds rolling herd average. So the economists, they took their data, they put it through some additional statistical analysis, and basically what they were trying to do is determining what were the key factors that led to profitability on a farm. So the p-value there on the left-hand or the right-hand column, the lower the number, the better, or the more significant, if you want to look at it that way. So as you look at this, the most significant factor leading to profitability was milk production per cow. And the second most important one was feed as a percent of total cost. So controlling feed costs becomes very, very important, along with milk production. So I think we really shouldn't lose sight of that as we start to look at how we keep farms profitable, and we start digging into feed costs, and we start digging into shrink issues. You got to remember that milk production a lot of times is going to drive profitability on our dairy farms, and we shouldn't lose sight of that. The other thing I want to make sure that we clearly understand is that dairy cows are a little bit different. We actually have a production cycle. We don't really have the option of just simply selling these animals after we make mistakes. Sometimes we're forced to do that, but ideally we'd like to take them into the next lactation. So, we spend a lot of time talking about what happens in that transition between the dry period and early lactation. That little 5% chunk of the pie really sets the animal up for this lactation as well as future lactations, because we need to get her bred back quickly. And if we have issues there, she may not breed back quickly, so that means that she's going to be long days in milk, or maybe have a long dry period. Either way, it costs us money. And many times I think we end up with animals that they're operating on the end of the lactation curve, where we have not very good efficiency generally, and that cuts into our profitability as well. So first thing, we need to remove all those production barriers that might be on the farm. There's lots of different ones. It could be cow comfort, could be associated with nutrition, it could be issues with reproduction. Some of the recent advantages or advances that we've had in terms of heat detection may help us with some of those things. Could be simple things like lameness. Sometimes on our farms when we start really digging into things, we're dealing with a bunch of lame cows. Lame cows don't eat, they don't milk, and they sure don't reproduce. So because of that, we've got to make sure that we're keeping that in check. And of course, hairy warts can be a big problem. And then finally, milking management. I mean, we can make a lot of milk out there with our cows by having the nutrition, the cow comfort, correct, doing the things we need to be doing on reproduction, having animals that are walking on a good set of wheels. And if we're not getting it done in the parlor, we're not harvesting what we've set up to the cows to produce. So that's really an important thing that we get out of there too. So now turning our thoughts then to this issue of feed cost and how do we figure this out. I mean, one of the things that I guess I've learned in difficult economic times, we actually become better managers. We're forced to. Either we do something about it, or sometimes economic forces will take us out of the business. So it really does force us to look at some different things. The other thing I want to impress upon you, if you can't measure it, you probably can't manage it. And we say that a lot of times when we talk about production records and DHIA, and same is true for feed costs. If we're not really managing things and watching things, we probably really can't figure that out. And we've got in the nutrition business, a lot of times we talk about, the 3 different rations on the farm. The one that was formulated by the nutritionist, the one that was actually mixed in the mixer wagon, and then the one finally that was actually consumed by the cow. So if we have issues with how the mixer wagon is working, we're not getting a good mix, then the mix that we present in front of one group of cows may be, different than the mix that's put in front of the next group of cows, even though it came from the same load. So then what's really important is, what has the cow consumed? Does she sort the diet or not? If she's sorting the diet, then obviously we have an unbalanced ration we need to do something about. So true feed cost on your farm. One of the things that I find that producers a lot of times forget about is this idea of shrink. Okay, when we talk about feed cost, a lot of times they will pull out maybe the ration that the nutritionist formulated, and they plugged in all the prices and stuff, but the prices they plugged in may or may not have included shrink, and many times I find that they do not. So there's lots of factors that lead to shrink on our farms. So if you're dealing with wet feeds that have high moisture, things like corn silage or haylages, or some of our wet byproducts like wet corn gluten feed or wet distiller's grains, those things can spoil fairly easy, and we can get some fairly significant losses that way. Also, wind and animals can carry this feed away. And I know some of our farms we're working with in western Kansas, we have a lot of wind problems. And we've looked at, the 3-sided commodity sheds that are so common on our dairies. And if you think about it, you're generally only taking feed out of there only about maybe 10, maybe upwards to 12 hours a day, but a lot of times it's only about 10 hours a day. The rest of the day, that feed is exposed to wind and animals. And some of our farms are actually looking at stacking hay or straw bales in front of that at times when they're not feeding out of it, just to try to cut down on some of that waste. So there's some things that we can do to make this work a whole lot better. Yet, as I think of typical shrink values out there, I think about the times when I've driven onto farms and I see uncovered piles of feed exposed to the weather. There's huge shrink involved in that. And if you look at that column there on the left, the first one, we could be losing anywhere from 5 to 40%, depending on how long that's going to be stored on the farm in that sort of situation. And obviously it depends on what kind of weather occurs during the time that's stored there. So many farms have gone to the middle column, the 3-sided commodity bays, and they're great. They sure are a whole lot better than having feed exposed to the weather, but there's still significant loss there. And if we're not weighing things in and weighing things out, we probably don't realize what that's costing, but it does take away a fairly high percentage of our feed. If we go to enclosed bins, which have become more popular in the last 18 months. That's a way to really reduce those losses. But again, you're going to still have some loss. We'll never probably get it down to zero, but can we get down to 2% or maybe even less? I think there might be ways to do that, and that would significantly reduce our feed costs. So if we look at, what it might cost to formulate a ration, and this would be on cost per cow per day for this particular ration, this would be the number that came from the nutritionist, $6.33 per cow per day. And a lot of times when I ask producers about feed costs, that's the number they'll give me. Well, when I start looking at it, they probably haven't accounted for shrink in any of those numbers. It's just based on what the nutritionist gave them, and of course the nutritionist utilized the numbers that they were given. And so we are responsible, I think, to help producers to start thinking about this. And this is why I think it's important when we look at adding the feed cost in there, or the shrink cost. So the first couple of columns there involve, we just kind of have some typical shrink numbers that we might see across farms. So, that feed cost per head per day then is about $7.04. If we do a pretty good job out there and, we're still using a three-sided commodity bay, but we're doing a fairly good job with our wet feeds, that feed cost is still $6.69 per head per day when we consider the shrink there. So it's quite a bit more than what the nutritionist figured based on our numbers. If you want to put those numbers side by side, this would be feed cost per cow per day. If we don't account for shrink, about $6.33 per cow per day, with kind of what we might find as normal shrink, if we're not doing a very good job of managing things, about $7.04 a cow a day, versus if we're doing a good job, about $6.69 per cow per day for lactating cows. So if you want to look at it on a per 100 weight of milk produced, if we, assume different levels of milk production, if we assume 60 pounds of milk production, you've got those three numbers, it'd be something over $10 per 100 weight of milk produced. If we're at a 70 pound, then we might be between that $9 and $10 range. If we're in an 80 pound herd, same sort of feed cost, we might actually get under $8 per 100 weight of milk produced. So this really demonstrates how level of milk production really impacts feed cost per 100 weight. So if we're not getting what we're paid for in terms of our nutrition program because we have issues with cow comfort or maybe milking management or other things, it really is going to make it difficult for us to be profitable on our dairy farms. So what kind of attitudes do I run into out there? Well, as I started talking with producers about this, actually about 10 years ago, as we started to getting some software on the farms that would be able to track things that we feed through our feed wagon, and then relating some PIN data to that, a few producers actually came on board and really started to put this information to work. However, most of the folks, either they didn't trust the numbers, or when they looked at the numbers, they couldn't believe they were losing that much. And as a result of that, a lot of times we still don't have the data on the farm that we really need. So without data, it's really difficult to manage this. Some view it as cost of doing business. I know I sat down with one producer, and they were actually keeping very good records of what came onto the farm and what went off to the farm, and we were just looking at their commodities. Didn't look at any of their silages, just commodities coming into the commodity shed. And over a year's period of time, it was a 6-digit figure is what the loss was. So very, very significant to the dairy. But in their, rather than trying to do something about it, they just looked at it as a cost of doing business. I think some folks probably suffer from out of sight, out of mind. They just, if they don't have the data in front of them, if they're not the ones out there that are actually doing the work, they just don't necessarily see it. I know one producer I dealt with one time, as I was looking over records, they had lost 50,000 pounds of molasses in 1 month. And I was like, how do you lose a whole semi-load of molasses? I mean, was there some sort of, did a tank burst or something like that? And the farmer kind of smiled and he said, well, you know what? We had a lot of wind this month, and The fill hose that dropped the molasses into the feed wagon was about 5 feet above the top edge of the wagon. So therefore, the feeder just allowed that molasses tank to run until he got the correct weight that he wanted into the feed wagon, even though most of it was actually ended up on the ground on the tractor and other places as the wind carried it away. So farm manager never actually saw that, but in trying to sort that out a little bit later after he looked at the data, realized what was going on. So simple fix to doing that, just lengthen the hose so it drops further down into the wagon, and then it's not such a problem. So sometimes that's the case. And I think there's some folks out there, they just, it's just not worth my time, okay? They don't understand how much feed might be leaving, and they just really don't think it's something they need to worry about. But I would encourage you that as we go down this road, I think more and more are going to see this as a potential profit opportunity. And this will be what separates them from other farmers. This will be one of the things that gives them an advantage. In a free market society, somebody will always probably try to figure out a way to produce something either better or cheaper, and this is going to be one of those things that they're going to look at. And in that, they think they can become more profitable, and I think they can too when they do those things. So we need to think about these attitudes as we work with producers on farms. We're going to see a lot of issues with that. So how big are the numbers? Well, if we look at if those numbers that we looked at previously, and if we just take the not doing a very good job with shrink versus doing a good job controlling shrink, this would be about a 35-cent per cow per day change in feed costs. And on a year then, if we had 100 cows, it'd be almost $13,000. If you've got 1,000 cows out there, it's almost $128,000. So very, very important thing, I think, as we consider true feed cost and trying to control true feed costs on the dairy. So just want to talk a little bit about some of those things we need to be considering as we look at this. And, one of the big things is what's happening in the silos. I know many of you are aware of that, but just want to remind you that face management, if you look in the upper right-hand or upper left-hand corner there, it's very, very important. Very excellent job there. And as you can see in the other three photos, we've got to a lesser degree of doing a good job of face management. And a lot of spoilage can occur out there, and that can be very costly, particularly if you're looking at a situation where corn, is $7.5 a bushel. So one of the things that, I think you need to think about is, what does shrink in a corn silage bunker, what does it do in terms of total cost? And then also, what does it do for cost per hundredweight of milk produced? So if we have 1,000 cows, we're feeding 30 pounds of silage per head per day. We'll look at three different values for that corn silage: $45, $55, and $65 a ton, and that's on an as-fed basis. And then the losses in the silo of anywhere from 10 to 25%. So go through the next few slides. So one of the implications is on shrink is really what is the true cost of the silage. So the red line, if we started out at corn silage that was $45 a ton, if we had 10% shrink, 15% shrink, 20% shrink, 25, 30, or 35% shrink, okay, that red line represents what happens basically to the cost of the silage into the diet. So we go anywhere. If we start at 45 at zero shrink, then at 10% shrink, that would be just under $50. And as we move to 35% shrink, we're basically pushing $60 a ton actually into the diet. Yellow line represents $55 a ton corn silage basically packed and into the silo, and the green line represents $65 a ton corn silage. So you can see as we have shrink, it really does change and really does impact the cost of that silage in the diet. Another thing I encourage farmers to look at is because of the shrink, we have to harvest more acres of corn every year. to make up with that. That's the only way we can have enough to feed our cows. So in this example, if you have 200 cows, you feed them 30 pounds of silage per day, and you have an estimated yield of about 20 tons per acre for your corn silage. If you have 20% shrink, the center of the chart there, okay, to feed those cows for a year, you're going to need an extra 219 tons, which is actually 11 acres of corn extra that you have to grow. So if you do something to reduce shrink on the farm, gives you more acres to either maybe grow corn for corn grain or maybe other crops. So it really does reduce what we have to put in the silo, because shrink is just going to be just leaving us, okay? So if you look at annual savings then, and again, we've got three different prices on corn silage, from $45 a ton up to $65 a ton, and then different percentages of shrink, from 15 to 35%. So this would be the cost. So, maybe if we're down in that 15% range and we're only paying $45 for corn silage, it's not a huge thing, okay? But if we're experiencing 25, 30% shrink, we're not doing a good job of covering silos, those sorts of things, and corn silage is worth $65 a ton. Even on 200 cows, we've got over $10,000 there that we're losing, that we could recover a major portion of that by doing some things to change that situation. There's another factor with spoiled corn silage or other wet feeds that we might feed and put into the ration. Keith Bolson several years ago did a study here at K-State, and this is with growing animals, but they fed 4 different diets, one that contained 0% spoiled silage, one that contained 25%, one 50%, and one 75% spoiled silage. And then they looked at the percent reduction in intake, and you can see as we go from 0 to 25% spoiled silage, it's about a 7% decrease in dry matter intake. And also the spoiled silage reduced the NDF digestibility of the total diet as well. So kind of a double-edged sword that we do there. So if we take a dairy example then, and if we see the same 7% decrease in dry matter intake because we feed 25% spoiled feed, that'd be about 3.5 pounds of dry matter, or about 10.5 pounds of milk. So I think there are some things as we have spoilage in the silo. We've got the physical loss of the feed, but then we've got the issue of what happens to that spoiled feed. Many times it does end up being fed to the cattle. And depending on, whether or not we're getting silage for this particular load from the top of the pile versus the bottom of the pile is really going to impact how much of that spoilage is being blended in. So something that we need to consider. And the reason I think it's important to consider that is maybe this is another way we can encourage producers, because they may be able to actually bring greater value to their corn silage if they reduce the spoilage and thereby reduce the amount of spoiled feed that actually makes it to the cows. So if we look at different levels, increases in milk production of 1 pound, which is the pink, up to 5 pounds, which is the blue bar, okay? Look at different prices of milk. Okay, and we'd be over there in that. Actually, probably should have put one in here that was $20 or $22, okay? But if we were feeding 30 pounds of corn silage a day, that means that 66 cows are fed off of each ton of corn silage that we have. So if we reduce the spoilage and therefore increase the milk production, let's just look at the green bars, okay? The middle bars there. And milk is worth $18 a hundredweight. That means that we've increased the value due to the increase in milk production of the corn silage by about $35 a ton. So if we can do a better job, increase intakes, increase milk production on the farm, then I think that has a huge impact long term. Is this going to be an immediate thing? No. You're going to see this gain in the next 12 to 18 months after you make the changes. But it's really, really important, I think, in overall profitability. And I would tell you one of the things that we have really worked hard on here at K-State is forage quality. And I think that's one of the big reasons why we've been able to make some of the gains that we've been able to make in terms of our rolling herd average here at K-State. So just want to, I guess, share a few things, and many of you maybe have seen this before, but just to remind you that infrared cameras are a good way to look at faces of corn silage. So when we see heat there, I guess my encouragement would be when we see heat, that's loss of nutrients. That's loss of the most digestible nutrients that we have in the corn silage. And once it's converted to heat, it's gone. So laws of thermodynamics tell us that energy is neither created nor destroyed, but it is transformed. So what we're seeing here is a transformation of the energy out of that corn silage to heat energy, lost to the environment and no longer available to our cows that need it. It doesn't have to look that way. So if we look at this infrared image in this particular silo, it's nice and cool. So face management, as you can see in that upper photo, this is really what a corn silage bunker should look like, or a drive-over pile. We should do a nice job of getting that cleaned up and keeping that face very neat. And we've got equipment out there that can do that. It's just a matter of taking the time to do it on our farms. Yet sometimes I see situations like this yet. Okay, uncovered bunker silos that have tremendous spoilage. This is actually a bunker in western Kansas. Okay, a few years back, silage had been put up dry. This photo was actually taken in the early summer. So, you've got spoilage here that goes down, major spoilage on the top 3 feet, but then you've got spoilage that continues on down in there several feet after that. So tremendous loss here. I would estimate the loss here is probably somewhere in that 25 to 30% range of dry matter. And in addition, you can see the effluent coming out of the bottom of the pile here in the front of the photo. And so we've got additional nutrients that are being lost there as well throughout the pile. The profile. So just want to encourage you to work with your producers, try to identify some of these shrink issues, keep reminding them. Probably the first time you talk about it, a lot of times we're not going to see any change, but you do need to keep it in front of them. It could take years, but eventually I think we can make some progress on our farms. And, just some things that I've seen on farms. So top 2 photos, just person loading that wagon out in the wind without production. How much blows away there? Well, we've measured it on some farms, and I'll share that data in just a few minutes. So it can occur with dry commodities. The bottom left-hand picture is a picture we're loading silage. You see those silage rolling off the front of the bucket. If we're on concrete, we can probably recover that. But if we're not, probably just going to be worked into the dirt and it'll be lost. So as you drive around the farm, be aware that there may be, when you see feed basically laying in the road, that is shrink. And those pounds really do add up. And then in the bottom right-hand photo, you can see this is a commodity bay I found on a dairy. I'm not sure how we feed out of this, folks. Okay, we've got mixing of feeds. We're trying to use a straw bale as a divider, which doesn't work very well. And we got hay mixed in with looks like distiller's grains. So just some real issues that we see on farms where we know we're not delivering the nutrition program that we actually formulated for. So as we look at maybe 3 different examples here, if we look at the base cost of soybean meal at $460 a ton, and we look at utilizing the shrink numbers that I shared in an earlier slide. If we have uncovered open piles into the diet with shrink, it'd be about $529 a ton. Even with a 3-sided bay, it's probably going in the ton or into the diet at about $497 a ton. Closed bins, maybe about $469. Same situation with corn, or a mineral mix that's maybe costing us $800 a ton. So doing a better job trying to keep these high dollar commodities into some sort of closed bin, or doing a better job in our 3-sided commodity bays really needs to happen. So this is some data off an actual farm, okay? And these are actual shrink numbers, okay? They have a scale on the farm, so every semi that comes on the farm weighs over that scale. They have a computerized system for feeding their cows and actually measure what goes into the feed wagon and then compare those numbers, what comes over the scale versus what went out in the feed wagon. And this represents actually a year's worth of data off this particular farm. And again, they have a three-sided commodity shed. And dry distillers grains, by the numbers, losing about 8.5%. Canola meal, about 3.5%. Whole cotton seed, about 5.2%, which kind of surprised me. I didn't think it would be that high, but whole cotton seed stays on the farm quite a while. And mineral, doing a better job with that, about 1.6, and flake corn actually about 2.7. And part of that loss in flake corn is probably associated with moisture because one day out of the week they actually receive a 2-day supply of flake corn. So probably just seeing some moisture loss there that adds to that for us. So on this particular farm, feeding about 4,500 cows, about 13 cents a day, or over $213,000 for the year. So very, very significant opportunity here for us to do something about feed costs. So some of our producers are looking at different ways of handling this. The upper left-hand corner is a commodity area for a farm, newer farm in Wisconsin. And they basically have 3 large bins. And they have a feed company that hauls in a complete grain mix. So they blend their forages with that mix and take that TMR to the cattle. So I think it's, when we look at feed cost, and again, feed costs have moderated, but in this last year, working with some farmers looking at what do we do with trying to reduce this shrink, these large bins like this may be a thing that we need to consider. They do put for larger herds, they put larger augers on those so that they do unload fairly quickly. So I think that's maybe an opportunity for us. Another opportunity, this is a farm that basically built an enclosed commodity area. So we've got basically 2 drives in this. There's a drive that goes down the length of the building. There's also a drive that goes across the center of the building. And if you look inside, the feed truck comes through the center of the building, pulls down into a pit. On on the right side, you have forages. On the left side, you have commodities. While the tractor is in here, you can actually pull a semi in, dump the load on the floor, and then continue feeding animals while the feed wagon's there, and then you can actually push back into bays once it pulls away. So is this expensive? Yes, but these particular farmers looked at their overall shrinks and are fairly confident that they will be able to pay for this entire structure within about 5 years. So they're expecting very nice payback on this structure in terms of what it does with overall shrink. Also a nicer place for their employees to work and basically to unload trucks. One of the issues we have in western Kansas is a lot of times in these 3-sided bays, we unload out on the apron. We're away from wind protection, so on a very windy day, something like dried distillers grains or ground corn, soybean meal, those things blow very easily, so we have a problem with that. Hay is also an issue on many of our farms and many of the smaller farms that I deal with. This is very significant. I've been on farms that, they just basically store the round bales on the ground, okay? Well, we've known for a long time that that's going to be about a 35% loss in dry matter. Also going to be a significant loss in nutrients as well with the dry matter that you have left. So having hay inside or having it tarped outside very securely is something that we really need to consider on farms that are not doing that. And in some cases, some folks have went to hoop barns basically for storage of these forages. And again, many times we can pay for that just in a couple, 3 years if we're doing something like the top picture where we're not covering it at all. Again, it's going to depend on the rainfall on your farm, but I think it's an opportunity to look at. The lower picture, tarping your hay supply, that's an effective way you can keep rain off of it, But I just want to point out that we need to have good drainage around these piles, because that water is going to roll off the top of the pile and fall down and be right at the bottom of the pile, unless we have adequate drainage so it gets away from there. Or we may lose the bottom row of bales, and that does unfortunately happen if this is stored for very months this way. The other thing I guess I wanted to point out is, as we move into fall and early winter, I'm sure many of you maybe are starting to see birds gather. I know they're gathering here in Kansas. And sometimes they are a major issue on our farms in terms of feed loss. And starlings, blackbirds, other birds that might come in to feed. If you look at starlings, 100,000 birds will eat about a semi-load of feed a month. And that's fairly significant, particularly if you're a smaller dairy. The other more significant thing about that is birds are great at sorting the diet. This is data from our feed yard here at K-State. Basically, if we have a diet that's steam flake corn and alfalfa hay, birds will sort out about 57% of the starch, and they will actually pick that flake corn out of there and leave the hay. If you have a rolled corn and alfalfa hay, you're going to lose about 38% of the starch, so smaller particle size for the grain. It's harder for them to pick it out, but they still pick it over fairly well. If you have steam flake corn and a corn silage-based diet, you might lose about 58%. So if you're using steam flake corn, if you happen to be in a situation like that, and you have starlings, they're going to pick out a high percentage of the starch. So you might have to look at when you actually feed animals. May have to try to feed maybe more heavily at night than you do in the morning, or feed several times a day to try to reduce the amount of exposure you have to these birds. And if you don't, your diet can be significantly unbalanced just simply because of what the birds are taking out of it. So there's some other things that lead to shrink on our farms. Delivery weight errors. A lot of farms I work with actually have scales on the farm, and everything that comes onto the farm they buy and sell over those scales. They're inspected, making sure that we get what we pay for. Scale accuracy can be an issue, particularly either with truck scales or the scales on our feeding wagons. Making sure that we keep those calibrated is very, very important in determining what we're actually losing on the farm. In the summertime, when we have a lot of flies, a lot of times, particularly cows that are housed in a post and rail feeding system as opposed to headlocks, you'll see a lot of feed on their back. Well, basically, they're tossing it back they're tossing it over their backs in hopes of trying to scare some of the flies away. Well, there's been studies that have actually looked at that, and they've indicated that there can be about 3 pounds of feed a day per cow actually tossed. So that might be about 20 cents a cow a day, basically, that's being used for fly control by the cow. So probably there's cheaper ways that we can do that as opposed to allowing the cows to do that. And the last thing kind of want to just address for a second is refusals. What are you doing with them? Do you have the opportunity to sell them? Maybe you have a neighbor that has a beef cow herd, and maybe that's an opportunity for you to sell that to the beef cow herd. Maybe there are heifers or other groups of livestock on the farm. We do have some producers today that if the feed is still of good quality, they will actually blend it into a low group diet, if it came from a high group diet. So anything we can do to reduce total feed cost on the farm without hindering animal production is something I think we need to take a look at. And that might mean that we sell that off the farm to somebody else. Rodents, most of the time, when we talk about this, we would talk about rats or those sorts of things. However, as we look at silage piles, we might think about things like raccoons, crows, and other birds that might discover that and come and feed on it. In some cases, the rodent might be something like an alligator that decides to crawl up on the silage bag just to sun themselves. And in doing that, they punch holes in the bag and lead to spoilage that way. So we got to remember that there are a lot of other things that feed, on our feedstuffs, and trying to keep those out of our commodity sheds should be a major concern as we try to control feed intake. And then finally, a lot of times when I pull on to a dairy farm, if they're feeding whole cottonseed and I go down into the commodity area, I see these white tracks where wet tires have picked up the whole cottonseed as they went into the bay, and then they track that whole cottonseed back out on the tires with them and around the farm. Pretty expensive way to decorate the roadway around the farm. One thing, the issues that we have as we look at TMR feeding and loading that feed wagon, we've got these nice loaders with big buckets that do a nice job of handling forages, but how do they do when it comes to handling things like ground corn or maybe a base mix, something that is more dense? And we got a big bucket there. We can get a lot in it, and we can dump a lot of feed into the wagon very quickly. So designed for forages, not so much probably for the concentrates. So if we've got a 150 cow mix here in the example, we've got the different feeds that we're dumping in there, and you can see the yellow highlights some of the errors. So we've got basically the target weight, the loaded weight, we got the deviation, and then the percent error. So when you have small things like the molasses there, and we have a 20-pound deviation on 100 pounds, that is a 20% error, so fairly significant. So as we look at what that costs then, taking those deviation pounds times cost per town, this is what the cost would be for that mix. So for that 150 cow load, it's about $34, okay? And some would say, well, that feed's going to the cow anyway. Well, that's true, but the fact that we're feeding more than what the ration called for increases our feed cost. And in this case, it's about 23 cents per cow per day based on 150 cows, okay? 1,000 cows over a year, if we make this same sort of mistake, every load of feed that we feed, it's about $83,000. So again, I think there's probably some opportunity here for us to tighten up the system a bit. And finally, we look at feed shrink, picture from western Kansas here a few years ago. And, there's some very simple things that we can do to reduce shrink on our farm. And in this particular case, if somebody would have just gotten out of the tractor cab, stuck their hand down in the windrow before they started baling, they probably could have avoided this situation. But the problem is we didn't take action when we should have, and therefore we're left with a situation like this. So I just want to challenge everyone that as we move down this road with our industry, feed margins are going to be, increasingly important, I think, in terms of overall profitability on our dairies along with level of milk production, and we really can't afford to make the simple mistakes. We've got to take charge of the situation and make sure that we avoid these sorts of situations, because the solution here was really, really simple, but we had to be available there to take action at the time that hay was baled. So I really want to encourage folks today as we look at feed costs and reducing shrink, let's make sure we're getting what we're paid for. Let's make sure we have removed milk production barriers on our farm. I think that's still a major thing as we look at trying to become more profitable and control things. Once we do that, let's take a look at what we can do with shrink on the farm. Concentrate on those wet feeds. If you have commodity buildings in very windy situations or commodity buildings that aren't well designed or built, there's probably some things that we need to consider there. Maybe some products really do need to go in bins. I'm aware of a farm in Canada that actually has a computerized system by which they put together their grain mixes, and basically a load of soybean meal on that farm. It's stored in a three-sided commodity bay, would last about 8 weeks. And when they switched to the computerized system with enclosed bins, a load of soybean meal then lasted 10 weeks. So huge savings for the farm. There's errors in feed mixing. For those of you that are working with farmers that do not have a software management system on their TMR wagon, I really encourage you to do that. Owners will really be have their eyes open as to what's going on the farm, particularly if they're hiring somebody to feed the cattle if they're not doing it themselves. I think I'm not sure how you manage that system without a software program on there. And then finally, consider what you're doing with refusals and on the farm, if those can be utilized either in other groups or maybe other types of animals, even if you have to sell it to the neighbor. I think a way to reduce your feed costs there as well. So I want to thank everybody for their attention, and we'll move to, I guess, the questions then.
Thank you very much, Mike. I have a question for you, Mike. I'll start off while people are looking to see what they want to put something in the chat box. You talked about the differences in losses between forages, especially silages, even hay versus grains. If I was looking at that correctly, losses from forages are tremendous.
Correct.
Higher than losses from grain normally, if in a decent managed system. Did I see that correctly?
Yes, you did. And that's, part of that is the inherent loss that's, something like a silage crop. We're never going to get that down to zero. I mean, it's going to probably be, even under best management, we're probably looking at something over 5%. A lot of folks that work in this area would probably say it's closer to maybe 8%, even in well-managed situations. So, I mean, just the fermentation process is going to result in some heat production, even done correctly, and that's the loss of nutrients. So, yeah, for many of our farms, major losses will be forages, and the major losses in the forages area will be the silages.
I think it also brings up another point when you look at those losses, and a lot of it is common sense, I would classify it as. Watching where you're driving type thing, but it comes into play, especially working with Dairy Challenge students, is training of new employees and the importance of training them to look out for those little things. And what the impact in explaining to those new employees what the impact is of those little things that they do or do not do correctly. I think that's something that a lot of times we often forget when we're training people.
Well, and I think to go along with that, oftentimes the feeders on our farms basically work very independently. Nobody's a lot of times around to watch them actually mix a load of feed, and particularly when we don't have any software system that we're using to basically try to keep track of what they're putting on the load and those sorts of things, we really have no idea what's going on out there. I mean, we can look at the TMR, we can see if it's well mixed. If there's something that's really, really out of whack with it, we'll maybe see that visually. But, I would challenge, on many farms, how often does anybody actually look at the TMR in a day? We tend to look out there, well, is their feed out in front of the cows or not, but we don't really see the TMR. So, you'd be surprised the errors that are going on a farm if they're not, if the feeders are not being monitored in some way. It can be pretty eye-opening when you start doing that.
Mm-hmm. We have a question in the chat box. Craig's asked the question, how many feed reps have you seen using infrared cameras for silage, looking at silage management?
The issue with that is the cost of the camera. And so I guess what I've seen a lot of times is that regional reps probably are more likely to have the resources available to actually purchase that camera. The technology is cheaper. A cheaper way of doing that if you don't have a camera would be an infrared temperature meter, and a good one of those can probably be purchased for $150 to $200 today. They're used typically in the heating and cooling industry, HVAC. So if you go to an HVAC supplier, they can probably help you out with that. So that would be much cheaper than the camera. The cameras usually are a few $1,000s.
Okay. Well, if we don't have any more questions, I'd like to thank Mike for being our speaker today and for an excellent discussion on how we can reduce shrink and feed costs out there. Thank you very much, Mike.
All right. Thank you all.